For our Hedge Maze scene, I'm using my default scene that I use within View that typically opens every time I open up View. And this is available within the content folder in the scenes. And you can load that in so that you can use these same atmospheric effects and also my modified ground plane material that I'm using to kind of have a bit of grass. Now the maze is mostly made of an image map that we're using to model the overall shape, and then we're going to be able to use functions within View in order to modify that image to create a really neat looking scene. And to begin with our image, I'm using Photoshop. Of course, you can use any image editing software you have available, because the basic techniques of this are pretty much the same. So I'm going to create a new document, and I'm going to create this at 2048 by 2048. And the main reason for this is our terrain that we're going to have is going to end up being converted into a standard terrain, even though we'll start with a procedural. And we want our pixel resolution to basically be the same as our terrain, which is going to be 2048. So we'll start out just our blank canvas, and I'm going to change our initial color to white, and I'm going to select our ellipse tool. And I can hold down Shift to make sure we have a round circle being created, and I just want to drag this out to almost the document bounds. And now we can go over to the layers, and if we right mouse click, we can select rasterize layer. Now we're not seeing the circle show up because it's white, same color as our background, and we're going to be using some of the styles effects to actually make the shape of our maze. And our maze is going to be a circular maze, although we could also make a rectangular maze with basically the same technique. I'm going to double click on our rasterized shape layer, and we pull up our layer styles. If we go down to the bottom, we can turn on stroke and then change our color to black. And I'm going to be using an outside stroke and just increase our size. And now these are going to be basically the edges of our maze and the areas that are going to be sticking out. We'll need to invert the overall image once we're done in order for that to turn out correctly. But what we want to determine now is basically how wide we want the edges to be of our maze. And basically, the smaller the size we have, the larger of a maze we can make. So now I have this, and I'm just going to go ahead and type in 70 pixels. And that is going to be the width of our hedges. Click OK. And I can hit V on the keyboard to bring up our Move tool, or go to the top over here of our toolbar and select the Move tool. And now I just want to create circles on the inside, but rather than rasterizing this image and then scaling it down, which we would then lose the overall width of our hedges, I can go ahead and just copy this layer, and I'm going to hit Control T, or you can right mouse click and go to Free Transform. And now if I hold down Alt and Shift at the same time, this will allow me to scale to the center. If I just hold down Shift, it will scale down to whatever opposite end I'm using. But if we hold down Alt and Shift, we can scale it to the center. And now what I just want to do is scale that down so we have about equal space, around 70 pixels, between each one of our circles. And we'll go ahead and just copy and paste that layer, or we can drag it down to the bottom to duplicate it. Control T, and then holding down Alt and Shift to scale that down. And now you can also basically complete this sort of an effect with a gradient on the style. If we open up our styles, we can go into a gradient overlay. And if we change that to radial, we can use some of the presets available and modify an overall gradient to create this sort of look with the stripes. but I find that this method is much quicker just by using a stroke, and that way you don't have to sit there and modify that gradient map when this way is much quicker. Scale that down, and we're just going to keep doing that until we get down to the center and the inside of our maze. And that looks like it should be our final circle. And now I want to create our connecting lines that we're going to have around the edges. And what I can do for that is go into our line tool under our shapes and set our width to 70 pixels, which is what we currently have for our stroke on each of our layers already. And just hold down Shift on the keyboard to make a straight line, and we can just draw that out. I'm going to change our color to black, and then we can right mouse click on the layer and rasterize it. Now at this point I'm also going to take all of these other layers with our circles and turn those into one layer. So basically you just want to make sure at this point that all of your outer circles and the overall shape of your maze is complete. And I'm going to create a new layer, just a blank layer, and drag this all the way down just above our background. And then with that layer selected, hold down Shift, select our top circle, right mouse click, and we can merge layers, or we can hit Control E on the keyboard to merge those layers. And now we have our new line that I had created, and rather than creating multiple lines over and over, I can just copy and paste this object. So I'm going to hit V on the keyboard for the move tool, and if I hold down Alt and just drag this, it will create a copy and automatically duplicate it onto another layer, and we can see that showing up. And now what I can do is hit Control E, and both of these are on the same layer, and I'm going to create a copy, hit Control T to bring up Free Transform, and I'm just going to rotate that into place. And it looks like I may need to move it to center it just a little, which I'm also going to do with our other layer. And now we can hit Control E once again, and now we have all four of those on one layer. We duplicated that again, Control T, and I'm holding down Shift to lock into certain degrees. In this case we have it at 45-degree rotation. And now I can hit Control E again, copy that, and just make a couple of different variations, just rotating these lines around. And now you can see in the center we have a little bit of jarbled lines where they're overlapping because it's not quite perfect. You can go ahead and modify that a little bit more. And you can be more precise if you want, but I like it to be a little uneven, and most of these lines are all going to be deleted. So before I go ahead and merge this new layer with our shape 2, which we can see, I'm going to delete all of and erase all of the pixels on the inside, because we don't need to have all of those lines in the center, and even all the lines we currently have in there right now will also mainly be removed. But this way we can see much better the outer edges of our maze, and it'll be a little bit easier to kind of plan out what we want to do with it. So we just want to make sure that all these areas are erased in the center. And now I can hit Control E and merge that. And now we need to plan out the overall shape of our maze, and basically just the insides and what areas we're going to cut out in order to make it into an actual maze. So I'm going to use first to plan out the actual way to the center, and the only way to the center, we'll be using a green color, and I have a new layer that I've created. I'm going to use the paintbrush tool, and we just want to scale this down so it's not too large. We've got about 40 pixels, and our hardness is set to 100%. And what I want to do is just start drawing in and coming up with an idea of the shape and direction of our maze. And we just want to make nice turns within each one of these blocks. And then once we have this first line drawn out, and this is our basically our pathway to the center, with one opening on this side, we could also add another opening on the other side, or where we want to have another opening. And now I'm going to create another layer, change our color to red, and these are going to be the areas which aren't going to lead to anywhere. So we can just start drawing out these spaces, and also having some of these areas kind of connect and diverge into each other. And we want to make good use of all of the available areas. So I'm going to be just kind of filling in our blank spaces. And just connecting a lot of our areas. And we want to make sure too that we're not going straight directly through too many areas and too many sections at once, because we'll end up with kind of a strange shape when we're done. And once we've drawn out and basically filled in almost every possible solution and area, we can start to cut out our different sections. And it looks like all of our squares are filled in. So I'm going to select our line layer now, where we have all of our lines going in. I'm going to move to our eraser tool, scale this down just a bit to 50 pixels, our hardness at 100%. And now what I can do is start to delete these lines in the areas where we have the pathways going through. And we don't need to worry about these other intersections just yet. First we just want to take care of this layer with our lines. And this is just a really easy way to create these different zones. And I'm just going to go around and delete all of these bits of line that are blocking our pathway right now. And then we can come back and start working on connecting all of these to lead to the center. And I now have our main areas cut out. And if we just take a look at how our maze looks at the moment, we can see that some of these areas of the layers I missed, so I can just go in and delete that. Just kind of erase that area. And some areas that look kind of strange are the straight line that goes down the center, some of these blocks up here. So we can always modify and kind of go in and customize it a little bit more. And just erase that area right there. You can go back and kind of play around with that a little bit more. Another thing you may want to do, which I didn't do in this case, is to just make a copy of this shape layer before you go and edit it. And that way, if you need to go back, you easily can. But now we want to start working on our other connecting pathways. So I'm going to switch our color to white, go back to our line tool, and we're working with 70 pixels, which is our width, and the same as before. And now what I can do is just start drawing in these pathways above our circular layer and just underneath our pathway layer, and just draw out how we want to connect each of these spots. So I'll just go ahead and finish that up, and we can take a look. And now I have all of our connecting lines created, and in some areas I have deviated a little from the initial lines I had drawn out, just because maybe in some cases, like with this line right here that we can see, go ahead and just zoom in on that area, it would have been difficult to draw out that section. So I just went ahead and made another connector, because those sections are connected anyway, and that's really what you want to look for, is just make sure that everything is kind of connected. What you can also do at this point is maybe throw in some more areas that are opened up and kind of play around with that a little. But if we turn off these lines, we can take a look at what the maze is turning out to be. And what I'm going to do at this point is go down to the bottom, just underneath all of these gaps we made and all of those layers, and just create a new layer which is going to be blank. Then go up to the top, all of those lines, hold down Shift and click on the layer, and then hit Control E and merge those all down. And we also want to go through and make sure that there are no areas with some leftover spots showing up, like this one. Go ahead and remove that. And just go around. And you also want to double check and just make sure that all of your pathways have a way through, unless you want to create a maze that is not completable. And that's just kind of a basic way to really quickly kind of make a maze. As we can see, some of these sections don't quite look right. We might want to modify that a little. In this section right here, I'm going to go ahead, select our white linking layer, and just delete that, and then go into our other layer and just remove that section. And that looks a little bit better. We could do that with other areas as well. But basically our maze is complete, and we now have our image that we can use within View to create our model. There are a few modifications we will need to make to this maze. What you might want to do is just save out this copy, or you can go into the history and create a snapshot, and that way you can always come back to this working area. But what I'm going to do is just select all of our layers, Control E, and just merge those. And if we go to our filter options, I'm going to select Blur and Gaussian Blur. And now we can blur the edges just a little in order to kind of round off the tops of our hedge, and that way we don't have really sharp cutoffs, and it's going to look more realistic with the amount of rounding that we use. So depending on the initial shape or the overall shape you want to have for your maze, you might want to really blur that. In this case, with this much blur, we've got a really nice blend throughout the areas of our maze, and we'll get very rounded tops. And also some of the bottom areas will be rounded as well. But I just want to round this, smooth it out just a bit. And that looks like it should be good around there, with 5.1 for our Gaussian. Click OK. And now we can save this out. And if we take a look here, this is another maze I had created, a little more complex. And this is the one I'm going to be using once we get into View. And you'll be able to load that up as well. It's located in the Content folder. So we're going to be working with this, which is something a little more complex. a lot more to it, a little more interesting looking. And still created in the same way, we just made our other maze, but our pixel length was a little bit thinner. So let's switch over to View and start working on our maze. And there are two ways to create the type of terrain and shape that we need. The first way, let's take a look, is just to add a standard terrain into our scene. I'm going to go ahead and size this, make it a little bit larger. And now if we double click on our terrain to open up the terrain editor, what we can do is click on Reset, and I'm going to increase our pixel amount to 2048 by 2048. And if we select the picture button, we can load in our maze that we had created. And now you can see that we will need to invert that layer, which we can do just by clicking the invert button, or you could also do that back in the image editing program. And if we take a look at proportions, I just want to blend this 100% all the way to our picture, and that way we're not blending with our existing terrain. Although we could do that as well, and since our existing terrain is black, the more we bring this down, it'll allow us to adjust the height of our maze, but I'm going to do that within the actual interface to make it a little bit easier. Go ahead and click OK, and now it's going to convert that image into our terrain. We can also use, at this point, the erode effects. And if we click on the erode tab, we have a lot of different effects. And the upper left one, and right now, because of my interface options, you can currently not see the text on our buttons. But the upper left one is going to smooth out our overall terrain. So we can just click that a couple of times, and that'll smooth out any rough edges that we have from the pixel conversion. And we can click OK. We can see our shape of our maze now. Of course, it is rather high, so what we want to do is just use our scale gizmo, and on the Z, just drag that down. And now we can see our maze. If I double click on our terrain, one thing that makes it a little easier to work with is if we go down to the clip on the bottom, we can clip out that bottom plane, and that way all of those areas are cut out. You can also do this to remove some of that rounded area on the bottom, but I'm really just going to bring this in to the point where we're just clipping out that flat area. We could smooth it out a little more. We could also use the paint tool to smooth out some of these areas by hand. But this gives us directly the image that we were working with. And because my default green grass was loaded onto the ground plane, it's also automatically loaded that onto our terrain. Let's go ahead and take a look at a render of this. Change this to final. We're going to render it to screen, and I'm just going to choose 800 by 450. We'll go ahead and just render that out, and we can take a look. And we can see with the standard terrain rendered, it doesn't look that bad. One thing to keep in mind is whenever you use the clipping on your terrain, you want to make sure you drop the object down, which I didn't do, which is why we have a little bit of a gap between the terrain and our ground plane. And in this case, our hedge is a little bit too high. So what I would do is drop the object and just scale that down a little. Now, the main problem with this technique is it looks a little too perfect because we had perfect circles for our image map, so we really don't have a whole lot of variation to really make this look as real as it could. So I'm going to delete our terrain, and what we're going to use now is a procedural terrain, so I'll go ahead and load that in. I'm going to scale up our terrain a bit, and now if we right mouse click, go to edit object, or double click to open up the terrain editor, I'm going to turn off zero edges, and that way we don't have the sides of our maze going down. If we go to our procedural tab, we can see that we just have that default fractal on there right now, so we want to modify that. I'm going to right mouse click, go to edit function, and that's going to bring up the function editor. I'm going to delete our simple fractal. We can go in here and add in a projected texture map. And then we can load in that same image. Want to make sure we invert that. And then under mapping mode, I'm going to select flat vertical, so it's projecting downward. And because we're going to be using some modifications and different filters and nodes to adjust the way this looks, I'm going to scale down our object a little and our overall image. Let's go ahead and bring that down to 0.7. And then our tiling mode, which is going to repeat after it reaches the end, I want to make sure that I turn that to none, and that way we just have that one image showing up. You can click OK. And it actually looks like that didn't save out, so I'll go back, and that's because I did not connect our altitude. So we do want to make sure that we connect our altitude to that image with the grayscale output, and now we can see our maze showing up. If we want a little bit of a better preview quality of this, we can hit ×2, increase our resolution, and I'm going to bring it up to 1024 by 1024. And now what I want to do is add a little bit of variation to the overall shape of our maze, so it's not perfectly round. And we're going to go back into that function, and a really easy way to modify this is to add in a turbulence node. And right now I just have simple turbulence, and I'm going to connect our origin of our projected texture map to our turbulence. I also want to change our preview that we're seeing in the function editor, because right now we really can't see our surface. So I'm going to go to our preview options up at the top, and I'm going to select a 2D plane. And that way we can really see the shape and the effect of our turbulence. If I click OK right now, just with our default settings, we can see we just have that nice little bit of variation. But I do want to make some modifications, so I'm going to go back to edit function. Our turbulence, I'm going to increase the wavelength and click OK. And now we have just a little bit of variation overall throughout our maze. And we could choose to use that option. We could go in and increase the amplitude a bit and really skew that around, if that's the kind of look you're going for with your maze. We could also increase that a very large amount to really change the shape of our maze. And now we have something that looks really neat. Lots of curves and much more variation than what we had before. Now, because our image map is white on the areas that are sticking out, we're not seeing at this point the way this turbulence node will affect the vertical of our hedge. So what I will need to do in order to actually see how the turbulence node is affecting it up and down, which will show up when we render, but just not currently in our preview, I would just need to make a little modification to our image map. So I'm going to select the connection and the line between our projected texture and our altitude, click filter, and then we can right mouse click, edit that filter, and as we drag down that right side, it's going to bring us into the lower ranges and eventually down to black. So we have white at the top, black at the bottom. So we could just scale down the altitude with this filter. And now if we take a look, we still don't see a lot of up and down variation. If we go ahead and click OK, it will show up within our render. and our scene, and we just want to make sure that when we're going up and down, it isn't really distorting the maze too much. Because right now, if we take a look in the preview, we're seeing a lot of spikes in different areas, and that's not what we want. And there is a way to modify that. But first, let's take a look. I'm just going to render this out really quick, and we can see how that's affecting the overall object. And we can see with the render that it does look different from our preview render, and the overall height does look correct for the most part. We do have a lot of errors showing up within the terrain itself, but there are ways to modify that and sort of customize and adjust that look to smooth it out. But let's go back into the terrain editor and just take a look at adjusting the z-axis, or up and down. And basically, if we don't want that up and down axis to really distort our terrain or image in that way, what we can do is, with the simple turbulence selected, go to our z and just give it a very low number, 0.1 or 0.05, and that way we don't have to worry about too much distortion on that axis. We can also see that our preview is showing up correctly now because of that change. But I don't want this much distortion, so I'm going to go back and edit our object, go into the function editor, and just modify the amplitude of this turbulence, because we just want a real small amount. Bring that up to 1.5 on the X and the Y, and then we can just adjust our amplitude and some of our other settings to just get a little bit of variation and just a slight amount of distortion. So it's still mainly circular, but just enough variation to make it look more realistic. And we can see the preview that is showing up in the function editor is a little different from the final preview that we have outside of it. So we just need to make sure that we're kind of playing around with this and customizing it. And that gives us a nice little variation right there. Edit our function. And another thing to keep in mind is the interpolation type. Right now we have it set to none, and what that can do is cause a bit of pixelation like we were seeing before. So I'm going to change that to bicubic, which will smooth out our pixels once we get to lower resolutions. And I'm also going to increase the scale of our image map that we have displaying this to 2048 by 2048. Click OK. And now we can see our hedge maze showing up. And I'm going to just scale this down on our z-axis. And we're still seeing that display error a little, showing up in our preview. Really depending on the altitude range we're at, it seems that when we're above our terrain, it is showing up mostly correct. But also, as we scale this down, we will need to open up the terrain editor and kind of let it recalculate itself, and then click OK. Just because our object mode, in the way it's set for our material, is going to modify that existing shape. And as we kind of move the camera around, it is sort of distorting our preview, but once we render it, it will look correct, and we're not going to be sticking with the procedural terrain anyway. And if we open up the terrain editor again, another thing we could do to add some more variation if we wanted, is if we turn on zero edges, what we can do is scale down the outside of our maze and then raise it up a lot higher in the center. And that'll give us a very interesting look. Also, if we have a maze on top of a hill, this is another way we can get it to conform to that and just make it a little more interesting. So with the procedural, we have a lot more control over adjusting our image map to really make the maze look the way we want it to. And then we could also change that even more to match our terrain shape within the procedurals, and really adjusting the function to match up with a different terrain, kind of the same way we just did with our turbulence. So there's a lot we can do to really customize this. But before we decide to render this out and really use it as our object, one thing I want to do is convert this to a standard terrain, because it will render quicker and we don't have to worry about some of those display errors, and then we can also smooth out our edges. So we'll go up to the upper left here and check off standard, and that's going to convert our image that we see with our preview resolution to a standard terrain. So you want to make sure that you're at the highest amount of pixel resolution that you will need for your scene. In this case we were at 2048. If you were down to 256 or 512, then it's going to convert your procedural to a standard terrain of a very low resolution, and you can have a hard time getting it to look correct once you've done that. So you just want to make sure that you have a very high level. And now if we go to our road effects, we can smooth that out with the upper left effect button, which is currently not showing the text on my screen. Our rock hardness we can bring all the way down to soft, just to soften that up a bit. And once that is taken care of, we can clip out the bottom, just as we did before. And you can clip this, either just the bottom terrain out, or you can have a nice little blend into the ground plane, or you could clip it out even more if you just wanted the rounded tops, and we could see that shape. And really depends on the shape that you want. Right now, if we went with this option, we would have to stretch out our terrain a little bit more, but it's much more rounded with the final look. So we can just customize our clip. I'm going to click OK. And now we can scale this down, make it a little more realistic. And let's take a look at a render of our maze now. And we can see this doesn't look too bad. I will, of course, need to drop this object down onto our ground plane. But we can see, with the way our clipping mode is working, and because the way we blurred our image initially, we have more of wedges than a straight up and down look for our hedge. So what we can do is just increase that clip if we wanted to really round that off and have a little bit of a straighter effect. Just take our clip and just clip out the lower area and click OK. And now we can stretch this out to match our height once again. And then I'm going to drop our object. And let's go ahead and render that. And that looks a little bit better. You'll also notice that because we clipped more of the bottom out, we have a much wider area in between our sections, and our hedges are a little bit smaller. So that's another way we can reduce the overall thickness afterwards. But what we need to take a look at now is our material. Because the grass doesn't look too bad from far away, but really it needs a bump map in order to make it look realistic. And I'm going to open up the material, and we just want to make sure we change this material name to Maze, and that way anything we adjust this material with won't affect our ground plane or won't get overwritten by the ground plane because they have the same name. And if we go back and take a look at our bump, we can actually use the existing bump map for this. If I bring this up to 0.1 and click OK, we're going to see a lot more detail on our maze. I'm also going to adjust some of our atmosphere settings. If we go to the Sun tab, I'm going to bring our pitch just up a little to brighten up the scene. And then we can move around the sun in the sky and the overall angle of it to get a good balance of light. And let's just zoom in to a closer area so we can see what the hedge currently looks like. Go ahead and increase our render size and render that out. And now we can see with that bump, it does look a lot better. In this case, we may want to tone that down just a bit because it is kind of intense. So we can go back into our depth and we'll change that to 0.08, or actually I'll bring that down to 0.07, a little bit lower. And we'll render that out and take a look. And that looks a little bit better. We could always bring that down more, but it really depends on what you want it to look like. We could also customize that bump map a little bit more with one of our materials that comes along with View. And first I'm going to go back to our atmosphere editor and just bring our pitch down so we can start to see shadows a little bit better. If we go to our light setting, light tab, I'm going to bring up our ambient, maybe make the scene a little brighter, increase our sky dome lighting gain. And I'm also using ambient occlusion right now. I could turn on global illumination or use radiosity to really light up those areas in the center. And we could also get a much quicker render with global ambience. And then we can increase our artificial ambience a little to lighten up some of those areas. But I'm just going to adjust the azimuth a bit, and that looks a little better. We'll go back into our terrain, bring that to 0.5, and now I'm going to use one of the materials that comes with View. First I'm going to just load in a sphere, because really we don't want the entire material. We just want a small section of it that we're going to be using for the bump map. So with our sphere loaded into our scene, we're going to go to Landscapes and load in the vegetation. Now you could also use this vegetation preset for your hedge, and that can look kind of neat. If we go ahead and open this up, if you were to use this on the material, you'd want to make sure that you select the two image maps we have, one for the bump, one for the color, and just change your mapping mode to faces, because that way you'll be able to get the sides as well as the top. And right now with automatic mode, it's just going to be mapping it to the top of the terrain. But what we want is this bump map material. I'm just going to select our texture, Control C to copy it. We can click OK, OK again, and we're going to go into our terrain and edit the function for our bump. If we click into the function, we can hit paste, and now we have that image map available. Another thing I want to do is remove this slope filter node, and that is going to adjust our bump as well. So if we delete that, we don't have to worry about any interference. I'm going to add a combiner node and just blend with the grayscale output of our projected texture map. Make sure we change that to faces. And now we have a little more variation that we can blend in there. If we need to adjust the size of this image, or we can change the scale. But first let's take a look at how this is going to turn out with the current settings. And we can already see with this rendering all of our bumps showing up from the bilinear interpolation, and that means that our image is way too large. So we'll go ahead and open that back up, and I'm going to change the scale to 0.1 on the X and the Y, and we'll see how that turns out. We may need to adjust its strength. And we can see that that bump is really way too intense. We'll go back and edit our material. Another thing you notice why this bump needs to be so small, or the image, is because our scale on the shape is at 20, if we take a look, which is what it is on our ground plane. And it does look better for the grass, but in this case it's really making our bump map a little too small, or a little too large, and then we need to make that image very small. Take a look at our blender, and what I'm going to do is just select that link, add a filter, and edit it just to tone down the overall value within the function itself. And then we could also adjust the depth and even the filter within the material editor to tone that down even more. And it looks like it's still a little high, so we'll go back and I'll adjust the filter in the actual material. Go ahead and render that. And now we're seeing it looks a little bit better. We're seeing more of that image map than we are of the procedural, the fractal. So we might want to change that blending mode a little and really just kind of play around with it until it looks the way you want it to. But it does look like we have a really nice looking hedge. I'm going to just make a few adjustments. I'm going to change our scale of this image map to 0.08. Just scale that down a little bit more. If we go to our blender, I'm going to decrease the amount of that image map that we're seeing, so we have more variation from this fast Perlin fractal that we're using. And if we start rendering that, we can see it looks much better already, even though it was only toned down a little bit. And then if you need to adjust the ground plane texture, you can do that as well. Maybe you want the bump map to be about the same. You could always make that modification to the default ground plane surface. And if you need more variation in the shape overall, you could also go back to that procedural terrain. In this case, we would have to basically create a new terrain in order to get back to that point, because once you convert it to a standard, you really can't get the procedural back. But if you wanted little bumps kind of on the top, we could combine that with a fractal to vary it a little bit more and really change the overall shape of the maze. And another thing we could do to add depth to the overall shape and make it look a little more realistic, depending on how close you are to the object, is we can actually add an ecosystem layer to this material, and that way we can have little bits poking in and out of our surface and our maze, but we will need to create a custom object for that and a custom plant based on this material that we currently have, and that way it blends together better, because if we just use the defaults right now, the color is going to be way off and it's not going to match. So first, if we're going to be doing this, we need to load in the plant we would like to work with, and there's a lot of different ones available. I'm going to use the fir tree, and we're going to start out with that. I just want to move our camera in so we can see this a little bit better. We can double click on it, and now I'm just going to adjust some of these settings. I'm going to bring the length down, adjust our fall off, and that way we're already getting more of a hedge looking shape for this tree. I'm going to droop it down a little and kind of flatten it out. We can adjust the angle, we can gnarl it a little more or a little less. And we just kind of want to bring that diameter down to -100 for our trunk, because we really just want the leaves. And even in that case, all we really want is the clip map. So we'll go ahead and click OK. And now we need to adjust our leaf layer to match the material that we currently have on our hedge. So we will open up our terrain, and under the color and alpha, I'm going to right mouse click and copy the function. Click OK. We're going to go and select our fir tree, move to our layer, that is our plant, and our leaf layer, and I'm going to basically paste our function, which it looks like it's not allowing us to do because we have a mapped picture. So let's change our coloring mode to procedural and paste our function. And now we have the exact same settings for our color production, and it will blend together much nicer. We'll also need to modify our ambient and diffusion to match that as well. So we'll go into our terrain, and under effects we can take a look and see that for the maze we have 60 and 40 for diffusion and ambience. And we can see those settings are basically the same. Our highlight I'm going to almost remove, and under our bump we can see that right now we're using basically just a very simple noise pattern, and I'm going to use the same noise pattern, the same fractals and image that we have set up for our terrain. So go back and edit that material, copy the function, go into our fir tree, select our leaf layer, and paste that function onto the bump. And I'll just reduce the overall bump mapping on that a little bit more. And even though it looks really dark right now, it should blend together pretty nicely once we get it built into the terrain. Another thing that is going to play a large role in the way this turns out is the scales and the overall differences we have between the scale of this plant and the scale we have of the terrain itself. So let's go ahead and increase our function scale to 20 for the color, and under bump I'm also going to increase that to 20. And that way it'll match up a little bit better without changing the scale itself of the plant, because we can't modify that scale without it really affecting the way the plant's going to look. And if you need to make modifications beyond this point to really match up the color a little bit more, because leaves are going to turn out differently, I'm going to remove the backlight from our effects, And now we can open up the plant editor, and we're going to save out a new species. We'll save the plant species, and I'm going to call this hedge. Make sure we incorporate the texture maps, and I'm just going to save this in the tree folder. And we can click OK, and then delete this fir tree from our scene. If you did want to make more modifications to it, you could keep it in your scene until you get the ecosystem to look correct, and that way you can tweak it and play around with it a little bit more. But let's open up the material for our terrain in the maze. We're going to turn on ecosystem to give us an ecosystem layer. We're going to add that plant. You can see that hedge showing up. I'm going to click OK, and we'll let that load in. And now if we click populate, we're currently not seeing anything on the layer. If I turn off decay near foreign objects, we still don't have anything just yet, so I'm going to increase our density and decrease our scale. Go to the environment tab and just make sure our slope range and altitude range are just about full. And now we can see that that is going to create a lot of instances. So I'm going to select no to populate, increase our scale, and now we can see that showing up. And I'm going to go back to our environment and just make sure that it's not generating ecosystems in the center and just on the higher slope areas and the flatter surfaces. We can pull up the altitude a little. And another thing I'm going to do is under density, I'm going to turn down below surface, and that way we're populating below our hedge, and also make sure that's proportional to the size of the instance. Now we can see we have little bits kind of poking out here and there, but overall one problem with this is the variance in our color from using an ecosystem, and that can cause some issues sometimes when using this technique, and also the overall color just didn't match up very well. So there's something else we can do in order to create a hedge. And I'm just going to remove our ecosystem layer from this surface. And I'm going to move over in our scene, and we're going to add in another object. And I'm just going to use a cylinder. Go ahead and scale that up. And then scale down our Z. Then we can move that down. And now if we open up this material, which I'm going to call Maze 2, turn on ecosystem, and we're going to add in that hedge object once again. Go ahead and click populate after we set up our environment, and just take a look at our scale. Make sure that decay near foreign objects is turned off. Adjust our density. And now we can see all those showing up. I'm going to increase our scale a little bit more. Increase our density to 100%. And now I'm also going to set up a variable density. Go ahead and edit the function. I'm going to add in an image map and use our maze image. Invert that. Set it to flat vertical. Make sure we're not repeating. Go ahead and populate. We can see that is showing up very small. So we will need to adjust our image size to match the overall size of our cylinder. And if we take a look at our cylinder, we can see its size is 83 meters. So we're going to go into our variable density, and I'm going to bring this up to 50 meters for our scale, or 50 units. We can see it's not centered now, it's a little too large. We'll go back, scale that down a little more, down to 20, repopulate. And basically this has to do with our origin point. And I'm going to change this just to object standard, and that way our origins will be a little more correct. What I could also do is just take our terrain from our previous maze and switch that with our cylinder into the center of the scene. We'll go ahead and open that material back up, click populate, and take a look at the scale. And we might want to size that down a little. Try 10, populate, and now we can see that showing up a little bit better. So I'll go to our scale and populate our instances. And now we have our hedge being created by this modified object. There's going to be a lot of variation, and because of the shape of this tree, it's not going to turn out quite the way the other object did. Let's go ahead and just do a quick render of it, and you can take a look at what it looks like with the instances rather than just the terrain shape. And if we take a look at just this partially rendered frame, we can really tell that this is something that's not going to work to create a maze. Because this type of material really won't work correctly. The type of tree that we have, I'm going to go ahead and delete that from our scene. And mainly what we could do is go into the plant editor and really try to make a hedge object that will work correctly and look correct. But sometimes that's just not going to turn out the way you want it to. So this is really my preferred method. It's just using the terrain, and then you just want to customize that procedural to add the little bit of extra variation to it, and then really play around with that bump map to get it to look correct. And you could also go back into that image in your image editing program to customize it even more. Maybe round out the edges if you wanted it a little smoother. You could go back to that turbulence node within View with the procedural terrain to customize it even more. And before, how we used zero edges in order to create sort of a dome shape. You could use that to place it on hills. There's really a lot you can do with this technique, and it creates a really neat looking hedge maze that you can use within your scenes, or really make it the main focus of your scene. And also keep in mind you can use this technique to model a lot of different objects within View. So using those grayscale image maps, you can go into the terrain editor and import them in and really make some neat looking shapes. You could use it to create walls and things like that, or even more complex objects.